Hello and welcome to Rooted and Unwithered. I'm Cole Newton. And after a bit of a hiatus, I'm back, and this is our series Ex Libris Ad Cor, where we are going through books and reading in general, and hopefully applying them to our lives, not letting them just sink into our minds, but go into our hearts and then into our hands and our feet. And so typically I begin this with Eowyn giving us a children's recommendation for a children's book, but she is not with us this week, though my second daughter, Gwendolyn, she will have a recommendation for us that I'll put at the end of this episode, since she will give it to us in Spanish. But I will still put the link for the book in the description, in the show notes. And I should also say that with all of these episodes, I put all of the links in the show notes for everything that I am discussing. So you'll see in the show notes that I put two sections. The first one is links in relation to this episode, and then the second section is me just giving a couple of links from the past week, things that I watched, maybe videos or podcasts that I listened to, or some articles from around the web that I listened to. And so you can see all those links in the show notes at the bottom of this episode. But today, this week, I'll be talking about the Septuagint, which has been a really fun discovery for me over the last couple of months. Let me begin with this. So I've been learning biblical Greek. So last year, about October, something like that, started tutoring my daughter's homeschool group. We do classical conversations, and of course they have a Latin portion in there. And so started going through those Latin sections. So this year the children, they learn John 1 through 7 in Latin. And so that got me interested in Latin, and I decided I'm going to start learning Latin. But pretty soon, once I started learning Latin and really enjoyed that process, especially since it's, got so many similarities to Spanish, and so that definitely gives a great beneficial and help. Pretty soon I realized, well, if I can self-study and learn Latin, I need to know the biblical languages. I am a pastor, right? I should do this. And so, interestingly, I'll probably talk about this later in another podcast episode about why pastors, I think, should at least give themselves to learning at least some basics of Greek and Hebrew. It's interesting. John Piper has a book called Brothers, We Are Not Professionals. In one of the chapters in there, he talks about the biblical languages. And the first time that I read through that book, I didn't highlight anything in that chapter. But after I decided, hey, I think I'm going to start learning some biblical Greek and hopefully Hebrew as well. I got out that chapter and it just struck me all over again, right? And so I've been diving into Greek. That's kind of taken precedent over Latin now, right? Again, pastor, right? I believe that should take precedence for me. I've been diving a little bit into Hebrew as well, but I want to focus on getting Greek down mostly first, right? So I am spending a little bit of time with Latin and Hebrew as well, but I'll move on to them a little bit more once I'm more comfortable with reading Greek, and that is my goal, is to be able to read through the Greek New Testament, the Old Testament Septuagint, which was where I'll bring this back to in just a moment, right? And so I started learning Greek, and that was great. So towards the end of Hebrews, getting to use that book, the most difficult Greek text of the New Testament, right? Just diving straight into that. But I've been preaching now for this first half of 2024 through the book of Exodus, which is in the Old Testament. And as you probably know, the Old Testament was not written in Greek, but instead was written almost entirely in Hebrew, though there are some sections that were written in Aramaic. And so my thought process was that when I'm in the New Testament, I'll focus on Greek. When I'm in the Old Testament, I'll focus on Hebrew, right? But then I started getting into the Septuagint. I looked at the Septuagint and noticed that there's, all of these references to it in the studies, but I had never looked into what exactly that is. I knew the very basic, that the Septuagint is the Greek translation of the Old Testament, right? But never got further past that. And so, but then, as I'm making my way through this back half of Exodus, so I've preached 2 other series on the first 19 chapters of Exodus, and so now moving through the final half of that book. So I decided to do some looking at what exactly the Septuagint is. And so if you've never been exposed to or heard what the Septuagint is, then hopefully this episode will be a good primer to you, because I've really enjoyed it and why it's beneficial, why we should take into consideration a translation of the Hebrew text. And so that is what the Septuagint is. So it's a translation of the original Hebrew text into Greek, and so it happened 200 to 300 years, so less than 300 years, a little bit more than 200 years before the birth of Christ, so BC, and the tradition for why it is called the Septuagint is that comes from the Latin word Septuaginta, which means 70. And so there's an old letter that tells us that kind of gives us the history, gives us sort of the mythology, called the Letter of Aristeas, that tells us that there was a need for the Jews to make a translation of the Bible into Greek, because after the Babylonian captivity, obviously the Jews were scattered all over the world, and because of Alexander the Great's conquering the world, Greek very quickly became the lingua franca of the world, right? That became the spoken language around the world, the common tongue, right? And so there was this need for translating the scriptures, the Hebrew scriptures, into Greek, so that Jews that no longer spoke Hebrew, that no longer could read Hebrew, could read their scriptures, right? And so the Letter of Aristeas, it says that there was this group of translators that were gathered together, 72 in total, right? Though I think but then it's just simplified down to 70, and the story of it is that they each went their own separate ways, right? They made their translations, their own individual translations of the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, right? Genesis through Deuteronomy. And then they came back and it lined up perfectly, right? So that's probably not exactly how it happened. There very well probably was a council of 70 translators, and maybe that comes from. So going through the book of Exodus, right? In Exodus chapter 24, there was a passage where God calls Moses and Aaron and Aaron's 2 eldest sons, Nadab and Abihu, and 70 of the elders to come before there. So maybe there was a gathering of 70 translators to give sort of an official sense to this translation, right? But we don't know. Either way, it's called the 70 now. So that's what Septuagint means, is the 70, right? And the first 5 books, that was what was translated first. And indeed, a lot of Septuagint scholars, if you talk about the Septuagint, right, then really the only one that you can really refer to as that would be that first translation of the Pentateuch, right? And so then the translations of other books, those happened over the next under the next couple of hundred years, right? So they kind of trickled out, came in there. So that is the basics of the Septuagint. So it is the Greek translation of the Old Testament, and it was translated before Christ, right? So after the Old Testament was closed, after the Old Testament canon was closed, and before the birth of Christ, so back in BC, right? And so since Greek was the predominant language of that time in the ancient world, right? This was generally the most common Old Testament that was used, right? And so we shouldn't think that casts any skepticism upon the Hebrew, right? Because we're in the same boat today, right? So today the majority of Christians do not read directly from the Hebrew text of the Old Testament, right? But instead we use English translations, right? And so that is, so this was the first time that really happened for God's people. But since then, it has been the pattern, right? So we do not, the majority of Christians today do not read directly from the Hebrew text, right? We use translations, and it's interesting, right? The New Testament, it was written in Greek. Again, it was written in that language, right? And indeed we call the Greek that the New Testament was written in Koine Greek, which means common Greek. So it was written for the common people, right? It was written so people could read it and understand it. And I think we should be comforted by the fact that many of the Old Testament quotations that the New Testament writers use, they take from the Septuagint, right? So they quote directly from there using the exact same wording because it shows that we don't have the same view of God's word, of God's holy text that Muslims do about the Quran, right? So that we're in believing that really the only proper way to read the Quran is in the original language, right? So now we believe that biblical inerrancy properly applies to the autographs, right? We know that there's scribal errors that happen and all that kind of stuff, right? But even in translations, we believe that we have God's word faithful to us, right? So there's benefit and there's much to be gained from learning the original languages that the text was written in, right? But every week I preach from the English Standard Version in English, right? When I read the ESV, I'm reading the Word of God, right? It is in English. It's been translated into English, right? And there's things in preaching through the text that we can make arguments for how it probably should be translated better, or explain how maybe better ways to phrase things and all that kind of stuff, right? But that English translation is God's word, right? And so we should be comforted by that, and so we shouldn't take the Septuagint as a contradiction or as an affront to the Hebrew text, right? But instead, we should be comforted that God speaks to people. He speaks to them. He originally spoke to his people, to Israel in Hebrew, right? That's where we get that's the original language of the Old Testament scriptures. And he continued to speak to his people, even as they were spread throughout the world. He spoke to them in the Greek language, and that's how the New Testament has come to us, right? And on through today, where we're still reading the Bible in translations, right? So what's the benefit? What's the purpose of using the Septuagint, right? Especially if we do indeed believe that the Hebrew text is the original, right? So Jerome, when he was making the Latin Vulgate, this is one of the things that he argued for, is that he argued for giving precedence to the Hebrew text, right? Saying that is the original text, and so some theologians like Augustine were apparently not on board with that, so did not believe that was the best way to go. But I think, as a Protestant, right, I would side with the Reformers and say that Jerome was correct, right? We do give precedence to the Hebrew text, right? The Hebrew text is what we believe to be to be inerrant, right, in how it was originally written down, right? So what's the benefit of the Septuagint then, if we're going to give precedence to the Hebrew text? Well, Peter Gentry has a really awesome article, and I think I'll do another episode on this. So it's an article in the ESV Study Bible, and I think the ESV Study Bible deserves an episode all on its own. It's a great resource. So he has an article in the back of the ESV Study Bible on the Septuagint, and I think that he puts it probably the most concise way possible. So he gives a couple of reasons for why the Septuagint is beneficial, but reason number 3, I think, really just kind of encapsulates everything. He says, since all translations involve interpretation, the Greek Old Testament, the Septuagint, is in effect the earliest commentary on the Hebrew text. End quote. And right, and I think that's probably everything sort of in a nutshell, right? So the very fact that this is an interpretation, that it is a translation, means that it's an interpretation, and this is giving to us how the Old Testament scriptures were interpreted just a little bit before the time of Christ, right? And of course, since many Jews this would be the way that they had access to the scriptures. This would have been the scriptures in the language that they knew, right? Maybe they knew a little bit of Hebrew. Maybe they didn't know any Hebrew at all, right? Maybe they were Hellenized Greeks, or Hellenized Jews, right? Greek-speaking Jews. So this Bible gives us a glimpse into the interpretation, into how the Jews were interpreting it in those centuries before Christ, and also gives to us the Bible that most Jews were reading during the time of Christ, right? And you see that as you get into the New Testament and you read it with the Septuagint, then you see these lots of parallels, right? And those sorts of things for definitely seeing how this shaped the New Testament writers. And so some examples of how this works, I think we can go from the text that I preached last Sunday, Exodus chapter 24. And so to get a glimpse for how the Septuagint can be beneficial to us, there was two wonderful places in Exodus chapter 24, and then a third one that we'll talk about in just a little bit, or they may have to be its own standalone episode. So there was one place in Exodus chapter 24 where, speaking of God summoning Moses and Aaron and Nadab and Abihu and the 70 elders to him, it says in Exodus chapter 24, verse 10, and they saw the God of Israel, right? And so in the Hebrew, that's, as Philip Ryken makes note, that's pretty plain, right? They got up there, they saw the God of Israel, they looked at God, right? But in the Septuagint, so they try to, obviously there's some issues there with, well, how exactly did they see God, right? Well, here's the way that the Septuagint translates that, right? So it says, and they saw the place there where the God of Israel stood, right? And so that's not exactly what the Hebrew says, right? It says they saw the God of Israel, right? But the Septuagint translates it into, and they saw the place there where the God of Israel stood. And this is the English translation that I'm using here is the New English translation of the Septuagint, by the way. And so now you can see how they got that, right? Because the only thing that's given description there is afterwards is the place upon which God stood, the pavement that's like sapphire, but also as clear as the heavens, right? So that's the only thing that's described. So it makes, so you understand their thought process, right? In translating it that way. But of course, this is a place where we should again go back to the Hebrew. Well, what does the Hebrew say? It says they saw the God of Israel, right? But even here, even in deviating from the Septuagint, even not even saying that the Septuagint translation is not the translation that we should use, it still gives us some insight into what the Jews were thinking at that time, right? As they were translating this, they were probably trying to wrestle with that thought process of well, they couldn't have possibly saw God, right? No one can see God and live. And so they gave this example to them, right? And so that'd be an example of something here that we wouldn't want to go with the Septuagint, but it still gives us an insight, right? But another place in the very next verse 11, in the ESV, it translates it this. It says, "And he did not lay his hands on the chief men of the people of Israel," right? Well, here's how the Septuagint reads there. "And not even one of the chosen men of Israel perished." Well, so notice that that's not a literal rendering of what happens, of what's saying here in Hebrew, right? That God did not lay his hand on the men of Israel, but instead it's taking a more interpretive approach to it, right? That not even one of the chosen of Israel perished. But again, that's a helpful interpretation, right? Although that's not a literal translation of verse 11 there, it is giving us the idea of what's happened, right? And it's giving us a glimpse into that thought process, right? Of the fact that they could stand in the presence of God, the fact that they could see God or see where God stood, right? We should be marveled that not even one of those chosen men of Israel perished, right? They were called into the presence of God. They were looking upon God, and yet they still were able to live. God did not strike any of them down, right? And we should marvel and be amazed at that, right? So those are two examples that I got from last week's passage, right? So again, that's how we should look at the Septuagint. We should look at it essentially as the first commentary on the Hebrew text, right? And just like any commentary, you can deviate from it. You don't have to agree with everything it says, but it can help you look at the text from another angle. It can give you clarity and insight, right? And so you may say, there's another example that I'd like to use from chapter 24, but I think I'll just do that as a separate episode of talking about how Moses being summoned alone to come near to the Lord in Exodus chapter 24, verse 2, has, I believe, some ties in with John chapter 1, verse 1. But I might do that next week. So, with all of this, well, you might say, well, how could I get into the Septuagint? How could I begin to use the Septuagint? Well, thankfully there's two new translations that have pretty recently come out, and so I'll put some links to them both. So the Septuagint that I am currently using. So again, trying my best to learn Greek, and one of the philosophies that I have been having as I'm learning languages is to just dive straight at stuff, right? So the editions that I got, and I'll put a link to this too, is a 2-volume Reader's edition, and so it is in the Greek, so it's a Greek edition, but every word that is used 100 times or less, or used 30 times or less in the New Testament, it has listed on the bottom half of the page. So it just makes it a little bit easier to read through there, and it's a nice, big, very, very well put together edition. So I'm just diving headfirst at that. So that's the edition that I'm using. There's two new English translations. So the one that I was reading from is a new translation of the Septuagint, a new English translation of the Septuagint, and so I'll put a link to that. So that one is technically, I think, from the Revised Standard Edition. They use that English translation as the base text, and then they make changes to it according to the English, according to the Greek of the Septuagint. The Lexham English Septuagint is the other translation. And that one is directly from the Greek, so a complete new rendering into English. And like with a lot of Lexham books, I don't have a copy of either of those, and nor have I read them. But I've heard that they're pretty good. I would probably say that if you were going to grab one of those Lexham's books, they're really pretty. They're really well put together books. They're like Crossway level books, right? But I do think it's interesting, and we'll have to do an episode on this as well. So you will notice that in the Septuagint there is the Apocrypha books. So you will have books like the Wisdom of Solomon, the Wisdom of Syriac, Judith, Tobit, 1st through 4th Maccabees. Some additions to the book of Daniel, some additions to the book of Esther, right? Things like that. But interestingly, they put the book of Enoch in there, which is not originally a Greek text, though I think there is Greek copies of Enoch. So it's kind of interesting that they put that in there. So it seems most copies of the Septuagint don't include Enoch because Enoch wasn't originally written in Greek. And so just a really quick note. Again, we can do more on the Apocrypha in the future. But just note that as Protestants, we don't have to be afraid of the Apocrypha. We don't have to avoid it like the plague. The Reformers and most Protestant theologians throughout history have recognized that the kind of capital A Apocrypha, the books that you'll find there in the Septuagint, are mostly pretty helpful, and they're good books to read, right? But they are not authoritative, and they never were viewed as authoritative, as scriptural, as inspired by God, right? And so the way that I would tell people this is if you read a book by John Piper or R.C. Sproul or something like that, right? That may be helpful to you, that may be beneficial to you, that may explain some things to you, right? But are you going to take that book as scripture? Well, no, right? And are you also going to be free to disagree with Piper and Sproul, right? As much as we esteem those guys, right? And think that they are great Bible teachers, right? But I mean, yes, we should feel free to disagree with them, right? Whenever we believe that we think that there's a better answer in Scripture than what they are giving, right? They are fallible men, just like I'm a fallible man, right? So in the same way that you would read a book by Sproul or Piper or Packer or MacArthur or any of these other guys, that's how you should read the Apocrypha, right? And so they're included because they have a long history of those books were originally written in Greek, the ones that are included there in the Septuagint, and so they have a long history of just being included in there, and so don't let that get you thrown off or anything like that, right? So we don't affirm those as being scripture, and there's not a history of them being affirmed as scripture, right? But so those are two English translations. Again, I probably recommend the Lexham English Septuagint because it is a completely fresh translation of the Septuagint, and Lexham books are just really nice. And if you do ever want to learn Greek and you want to dive straight at it, then the Reader's Edition, that 2-volume Reader's Edition, man, it is a great book, but it does require Greek in order to know it, and so that is all for this episode. I hope this has been helpful. I hope it's clarifying to you and how you might be able to use the Septuagint for your studies, and so and not be afraid of things like this. Thank you so much for listening. For more resources for knowing and loving God's Word, please visit bcnewton.co. And until next time, grace. Hola a todos, estoy aquí con una persona muy especial para mí.
Hola.
¿Cómo te llamas, niña? So, esto es mi hija Gwendolyn,
sí.
Y ella quiere presentar uno de sus libros favoritos.
Sí.
Y este libro es sobre ¿cuál hombre?
Señor Whitfield.
George Whitfield, señor Whitfield. Sí. Y George Whitfield, él predicó, ¿cierto?
Sí.
Oh.
Sí.
¿Y él predicó en una iglesia?
No.
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 ¿Dónde?
Afuera.
¿Afuera?
Sí.
¿Por qué?
No sé porque no hay mucho paso.
¿Porque no fue mucho espacio?
No.
Él estaba predicando a tantas personas que necesitaba predicar afuera.
Sí.
Oye, esto es un buen problema,
Sí.
¿cierto?
Sí.
Un buen problema, ¿sí?
Sí.
Oye, y esto es uno de tus libros favoritos.
Así.
¿Y hay otros libros similar a esto?
Así. Sí.
Sí, hay uno sobre Katie Luther.
Así.
Y esto es chévere también. Y te gustan mucho los dibujos de los caballos
Sí.
y los barcos.
Sí.
Oye, ¿tú piensas que otros niños necesitan leer este libro?
Así.
Sí. Okay. ¿Hay algo más que tú quieres decir sobre este?
Así.
Ok. Muchas gracias, Gwendolyn. ¿Tú puedes ayudarnos otra vez?
Sí.
Ok, voy a verte más tarde. Chao.
Chao.